Hello and welcome to Computer Séance, a podcast featuring spirited discussion about AI and popular culture. I'm Justin.
I'm Ben.
And I'm Tracy.
Each episode, we take a seat at the table to conjure the spirits of AI past, present, and future, trying to find the meaning in the technological wonders imagined within popular fictions. All ideas presented in this podcast are understood to be the presenter's own. They do not reflect the thoughts, ideas, opinions, or positions of our employers, their programs, or their representatives. Tracy, what do you have in store for us today?
Today, I'm calling in two hot babes, Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe, in their 1995 American science fiction action film, Virtuosity, directed by Brett Leonard. I think this movie has a lot in it that we can talk about. And before we do, I just want to remind our listeners, if you haven't seen the film and spoilers are going to just ruin your day, pause this podcast, go and watch this film, and then come back to us. I should warn you, though Virtuosity was Crowe's breakout performance in the US, critics panned it. It's largely considered one of Denzel Washington's worst films. So in the film, the Los Angeles Police Department, the LAPD, are using an artificial intelligence system that is based on data from serial killers and psychopaths to train the police. It's early days in the testing protocol, and the company managing the project is using prison labor to engage in the dangerous training scenarios in a virtual world. One of the company's most vicious AIs, Sid 6.7, played by Russell Crowe, manipulates two computer programmers into releasing him into a synthetic body being developed by the company. Denzel Washington stars as disgraced former cop and current prison inmate Parker Barnes, who was enlisted to hunt down and capture Sid 6.7, who is now in his new body on a murderous rampage in the city. Before we get any further, Ben and Justin, had you seen the film before? And now that you have, would you recommend it?
So I just watched it this morning. I would say I am mildly entertained. The highlight for me is actually Russell Crowe's body acting, which I thought was really interesting. I would like to watch that again, both in the virtual space and then when you get to nano body, he pulls off being cruel and robotic.
I had not seen it before. I can't tell if I'm happy I've seen it now or not. However, I would recommend this to anyone who is afraid of the internet or who likes or might like Russell Crowe's butt.
Ooh, indeed. So in addition to focusing on Russell Crowe's butt, I'm going to focus on three aspects of the movie that I think make it a good specter for us to raise. First, I want to talk about how this whole world that this AI lives in which enormous tech innovation is not accompanied by equally enormous social innovation. It's a common thread that I see in a lot of tech-focused science fiction, and I kind of want to talk about what that means and why that is. Second, I think it makes some interesting predictions about the future of technology that I want to touch on, including aspects of ethical and responsible AI, as well as what's a pretty cavernous gap between what we think technology can do or might do in the future and what it really does do now. And then finally, I think it makes an interesting connection between physical desire and consent that I want to thematize in talking about how Sid gets his body and what it means for him to be an embodied AI. So let's summon the spirits. So I just wanted to start talking about this AI system as a whole that's being used to train the police. How did you both understand how it worked? What did you think about the design?
So there's some AIs or AI personalities that are coded on some kind of little nugget chip. And these can be loaded up into a kind of environment. And the environments we see is initially a sushi restaurant. And later on, we see a chessboard. And actually, in the ending scene, we see another environment that's mimicking part of the real world. So you can kind of plant the AI into a rendered world. There's a lot of non-player characters or NPCs in the sushi restaurant that I find quite interesting and different ways of interacting. There's also a kind of fun control room with the actual bodies being in these medical dentist chair things plugged into everything. So it's a very embodied, full body experience.
I would actually say it's not an embodied experience. I would say it's a networked experience. But I think the world in which we enter into is such a beautiful 90s dream of what the internet will enable and what the AI will become. And the scenography is brilliant in terms of just always having in every shot some sort of cable connecting something, except when they're doing the kind of running around in the virtual environment, being cops in that training scenario. later on every scene, there is something that is connected out of the frame. And I kind of love that they were like really going for it with like connectivity.
What you're describing is basically the testing hardware that the prisoners use to enter this virtual world, right? So we might want to say that when they're in the virtual world, they're trying to hunt Sid down. And somehow there is some crossover between physical violence or harm that can come to you in the virtual world, coming back to you in the physical world via this training device. There's a large cast of characters that are around the development of this system. Who stands out to you, and what competing interests did you observe in the movie?
I thought there's an interesting line early on from, I guess, the police chief or the person in charge of police training, who was like, I thought virtual reality was going to be a safe space.
Right, yes.
And this is a very kind of prescient remark, right? Maybe in the 90s might have had a lot of ideas about what virtual space or cyberspace, as it was then called, would be like. And you could imagine various possibilities into it. I think it gives a false idea of its safety. So I thought that was a really interesting moment. And I guess from the police training point of view, there is a complexity to the scenario in the sushi restaurant, which you wouldn't get on a training range in a live fire exercise, I guess. Although Denzel's character doesn't really respond to that because he's quite happy to shoot through the non-player characters because they're, quote, not real.
The character that stood out for me in this little world was Louise Fletcher's character, Elizabeth Dean. She's the kind of like mother. Surprising that I focus on the mommy character. She's sort of in charge of this training protocol. She's the one who's kind of managing this. I just loved her. I thought she was just like, why is she there? And what does she have to do? But I think it's important in terms of the kind of gendered politics.
I did feel like the women characters were just sort of shoved in there.
Yeah, they had to round out the cast somehow. And so they did that.
Could have merged several of the men in suits. Yeah. I felt like the men in suits blurred into each other and didn't have enough to do. And I was a bit disappointed. William Fichtner, I think, who is a actor I really like in some other things, just didn't have anything to do other than get punched by Russell Crowe.
I guess I focused on the two computer programmers because I thought that the way that they're portrayed was interesting, you know, as being these sort of valueless, moralless people who are just seeking to make their dreams come true, see their research through. But I want to come back to the comment about prison labor because this is a big theme. I just read a recent paper from this year by a person named Gary Griffin talking about how we make assumptions that technological progress and social progress go hand in hand. And he did this really interesting kind of review of whether or not that's true. And he had made a lot of arguments that technology hasn't, like especially AI technology, has not translated into broad-based improvements in things like wages or labor market opportunity or social well-being. And he cites a couple of reasons for this. Productivity growth has been decoupled from wage growth, job quality declining because of the gig economy. But one of the most interesting findings was that it's technology deployment that shapes inequality. It arises from institutional and policy choices. So your buddy there, who I think, is she the head of the police? Is she the police chief? Or
yeah, she's the one who offers the pardon, so she must be. Yeah.
And in most cases, he writes, AI designed to mimic humans leads to displacement rather than augmentation. Everybody's telling us that these AIs are going to help us do our jobs better. So the gains from AI technology are accrued to companies and institutions, not to workers. And it comes up over and over again.
The kind of prison labor training aspect of this is something that's actually happening right now with contemporary AI, right?
So where do you see the examples of that currently?
The example I know about is in Finland. So with a lot of the labeling of data for English language, large language models, this is being done by low-wage workers in the global south who are fluent in English because of the legacies of colonialism, and the companies employ low-wage workers to do this laborious labeling of data for the very manual process of artificial intelligence. But in trying to train a Finnish large language model, there are not many low-wage Finnish speakers in the world because it's a rich, high-wage country. It doesn't have the same international language community because of its own history. So it's actually using, or a tech company there is using Finnish prison labor as a low-wage Finnish-speaking population.
Yeah, I guess that's the big hidden thing that a lot of people don't like to discuss, that every single industrial revolution or big leap in technological progress has been accompanied by some sort of exploitation of low-wage workers.
One of the many things that's hidden by the conception of AI that we have, that it's artificial, that it's sort of a technology thing, that it's a very manual process. And I think that is material usage, but also its human labor is obscured by the language we use around it.
One of the things that really stood out to me was the way in which the film was actually prescient in thinking about the ways in which all bodies would become surveilled and kind of an instrument of broader information gathering. When we decide what is a car and what is a bridge for Google, we are helping train various models and understanding what representations are there in the virtual world. We see this kind of shift into how are humans being deployed as instruments to support what will become a repressive apparatus. And it's obvious that we start with the prison and the kind of multiple matrix of hierarchies that's operating here, because of course we have a fallen cop who also is a black man in America. And we have all of these shifts in where power would sit and how freedom would be felt in that.
We didn't really talk about the prison yet, but it's like this panopticon, invasive biometrics type of prison.
I mean, with prison guards that are supportive of a Nazi, right?
The race politics are really problematic throughout.
Even just the fact that it's the Los Angeles Police Department.
With respect to Rodney King, exactly. I think one thing about the prison itself, when you watch it, I was hyper aware that it felt like a hard drive. Like the idea of like a Tron-esque hard drive. You can see the way in which that version of a future prison has translated into other kind of contemporary versions of prisons.
So what I'm thinking of is we're seeing prison as a virtual space, right? But now if we start to see the prison as a kind of computer, prison as a place of virtual observation, should we then be reading that back into some of the other things?
The prison is a virtual space because it's a non-place, right? It operates as this kind of liminal space of quote unquote reform and or kind of carceral victimhood and trauma. And of course, it has to be that kind of the only virtual space other than education that we can have, right, to offer in our Western society.
I just want to take us to the part of the movie where in this simulation that Denzel Washington's character, Parker Barnes, is taking part in, his colleague, another prison inmate alongside him, is killed by Sid messing with some of the programming in his training data somehow. There's a scene with Dr. Daryl Lindenmayer, who is the creator of Sid, and also actually of another AI we're going to talk more about later called Sheila, who is sort of like a simulated sex worker or some other type of AI that is supposed to fulfill desires and sexual fantasies. And I just want to play you a little clip of Sid talking with Dr. Lindenmayer after the event where he has killed this other inmate.
And I have to tell you, killing for real, it was a real rush. My God, which God would that be? The one who created you, or the one who created me? You see, in your world, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, but in my world, the one who gave me life doesn't have any balls.
So in this scene, Sid is comparing his relationship with his creator to a human being's relationship with their creator, which he's calling God in this case. And it just struck me as being very relevant for the times. We did this symposium called After AI, and this idea of artificial intelligence occupying the God spot, as was described by our colleague, Mustafa Ali. I think that's really visible in this quote between Sid and his creator. I'm wondering how far this metaphor extends. The idea of God creating humans in his own image. Lindenmayer creates a sex bot and this super psychopathic serial killer Sid. And I'm just wondering what that says about him as a person developing this type of technology. And I think it kind of highlights the personal morality of engineers in bringing some of these types of inventions to life. Any thoughts?
I wasn't sure about Lyndon Meyer's motivation. He doesn't want Sid to be destroyed, which I can kind of understand because Sid seems to be intelligent and learning and so on. To switch him off would be to take a life, or maybe his motivation is scientific or so on. But Lyndon Meyer's character is also fine about completely discarding Sheila. So it's interesting, he doesn't care about Sheila at all, right? So he doesn't just put her personality chip back in another box, he sort of kicks it away. So it made me think that, I guess, Lyndon Meyer is being manipulated by Sid, and I guess some of the characters that have gone into Sid have been manipulative characters. I thought Lyndon Meyer's relationship to Sheila was interesting. The other tech guy who's developing the nanobodies, he's there kind of staring at Sheila in this kind of sexy chess scene. Lyndon Meyer says something like, Sheila is responding to whoever's kind of plugged into the machine. It reminded me a bit of, there's that early chatbot where there's a female character, Eliza, who agrees with kind of whatever people say, and all these men fall in love with the chatbot and are really upset that it's not real. Reminded me a bit of that. And so Sheila is responding to this nanobody guy by like getting undressing. But Lyndon Meyer says something like, funny she's doing that for you. With me, she's just become a better chess player.
Mm.
It makes me think that Sheila's maybe has more strings to her bow than we see in the scene potentially. But he's completely dismissive of her and yet will seem to do anything for Sid. So I kind of think about their relationship, and you can see in the scene we just listened to that gentle piano music at the beginning. And I think Sid looks pretty handsome in that. Is there a kind of dominance romance thing going on between them?
That's somewhat similar to how I was thinking about it. To me, Lyndon Meyer is a queer-coded character. It's evidenced by the fact that he does discard the female and he wants to maintain the only thing that a queer person can maintain, which is a representation of their own future ontology. Through this apparatus of Sid, he has helped create this knowledge system that is also a masculine ideal, a thing that he can't ever kind of approach fully. I read him as queer the whole time. It brought to me Judith Butler's question of bodies matter, right? And in this case, the film is going to tell us that white bodies matter and that Black bodies are in service of sustaining whiteness in America. And that's evidenced by the fact that Denzel's character, Parker's child and wife, are killed by a white man. And his job is to stop the white little child dying at the end so that we can have white America move forward. Lyndon Meyer's queer whiteness doesn't mean that he is queer in a joyous sense. He is radically gay in a nihilistic sense. That's how I read this.
That's so interesting. I did not see that at all. But when you say it, it also explains Ben's comment about the chess. If he's not seeking sexual gratification from Sheila, then obviously he wouldn't have the same kind of relationship with her. I have to say, like, initially I thought it was maybe like a misogynistic trope. You know, coded AI are not built for intelligence. They're built for gratification in some way. Again, we've talked about this before, but like the female coded voice assistants and like a service robot. Yeah. But I think that's a really interesting point that you make.
Yeah.
And you're kind of moving us in the direction of how Sid gets his body, which I think is interesting. We have this moment with Clyde, I think his name is, the other programmer who's making the nanobodies. I find it funny that it was really not that hard. He proposes, you know, right at the start, hey, how about we put one of my, he calls them Lyndon Meyer character modules, right? Those little gemstone-like things that hold the character of the AI in it. And Lyndon Meyer says to Clyde, hey, why don't we put one of these in one of your nanobodies? And Clyde's like, no. And then he's like, what if it's Sheila that we put in there? And he was like, oh, yeah, okay. Like, he didn't even need to twist his arm a little bit to get him to agree to try this completely experimental, potentially dangerous AI into a body. I mean, it's never been done before. It's totally experimental. He doesn't even know what will happen, and he agrees readily.
But it has been done. That's the key thing. And this is where we bring back the God moment, right? Because obviously the snake is the first nanobody that we see. And so we have this Garden of Eden moment where we have the kind of like, we could have knowledge from Eve, the Sheila character, but the snake who regenerates with glass, right? I love that we have this phallic symbol that regenerates, right? This is phallocentrism. This is just white masculinity. Yes, it might be queer impetus to think about it from Lyndon Meyer's perspective, But what it's doing is maintaining a very specific status quo within a broader cultural schema.
All right. I'm going to share one of the scenes where Sid gets his body with you.
Sheila? No, I'm Oedipus. Hail, Dale. Gravity.
So in that scene, in addition to there being like a really interesting and surprising like disco soundtrack, you see Russell Crowe struggling out of this cocoon-like egg, lots of gurgling, wet noises. And the very first thing he does is strangle Clyde. And then he goes to take a step forward. He stumbles and he says, "Ooh, gravity." What were your kind of reactions to this scene?
His ass is very prominent, and that was exciting for me sexually. I loved how it was doing that thing that everything in the 90s and 2000s did, like Splice, all these other films that were like, and we can create these nanotechnologies, like an egg. I like the representation of the egg. Also, again, not human reproduction, so a queer reproductive form. We can incubate these character modules, is what we're told before this scene. And so, again, we're seeing this kind of like queer reproductive futurism operating that is nihilistic, that is trying to repress and control society in a very specific way, potentially a white power way. And so what we watch is a virtual AI escape its virtual confines into a enfleshed body, even though it's a nanotechnology body. And we are given a masculine ideal here, a white masculine ideal, where we have a lot of muscles, we have a very clean cut face. If for those who haven't seen it and those who are listening, you could imagine American Psycho meets like The Cleavers, this very specific sense of what white male capitalist entities will look like, groomed and fit, no beard. So that was important.
I mean, remember that Sid is also meant to represent everything that is sadistic, intelligent, and dangerous. Ben, what about you?
Just picking up on Justin's point about all the different kind of technologies that are at play in this film. So there's the virtual, in the title. We also have the nanotechnology. We have the artificial intelligence, all kind of coming together in this blurred way. And I think it creates a really interesting kind of set of different embodiment to try and act, right? So Russell Crowe has to kind of act as an artificially intelligent virtual character in a virtual space, and then as a nanotechnology embodied artificially intelligent character in an actual space, and so on, which I think is pretty hard to pull off. I think he does a pretty interesting job of trying to do that, and also trying to be this character that is a kind of merged or like outcome personality from all these serial killers and mass murderers. I thought it was also interesting, the idea of the computers, when they were looking into the computer programs, it was a very movie-friendly visualized interface. So we saw like face models of all the different personalities merging together and so on. And that's kind of interesting. It makes me think about, was something about their bodies important in their personalities?
That's so interesting for me because I kept thinking, how would they even have this data to share with Sid? Like, what's the most that they could have is maybe how that person represented themselves in conversations with psychologists or police officers or whatever. They wouldn't really have insight into their actual character. And I'm wondering, is it going to be like a Jurassic Park thing? Do you remember where they take the DNA from a frog and then they can fill in the rest based on what they have? I'm wondering if that's the idea behind this technology, but this idea that Sid already has embodied knowledge is really confusing for me because there's a lot of research that's being done right now about how you're going to teach machines about the laws of physics. And that's why that comment of him saying gravity made me laugh so much, because that's very difficult to explain in robotics. It's a problem that people are working on right now. And this movie is supposing that it's resolved in a way that I don't think is currently technologically feasible, which is unimportant in these types of movies. I just thought it was interesting.
One of the things I'm interested in terms of how the movie articulates this genetic data that is enabled to make the character profiles was a question of haunting, actually. I think of this in kind of a hauntological relationship to the social, using Avery Gordon's notion of hauntology, which I will read because I don't want to misquote. Haunting, according to Gordon, is the language and the experiential modality by which we might aim to understand how, quote, abusive systems of power make themselves known and their impacts felt in everyday life. I think that the gravity of the situation is that we are haunted by so many typologies of white masculinity that aim to traumatize, destroy, and eradicate anything different. The thing that's haunting this film is not the specter of the internet and connectivity and sociotechnology, but actually the limit test of a race to follow through. I know I'm harping on about the racial politics of this, but it's so specific. Denzel is the only Black character, and he has to do a lot of heavy lifting in this. And that's because he's having to bear the entirety of one race in one kind of body and deal with the kind of sociological imagination of trauma that is performed through this character modality. We are haunted by these traumas. And indeed, Denzel's character is haunted by one of those characters who we'll find out is the person who killed his wife and daughter. And that becomes really important in terms of why he goes forward with it. It's a really loose kind of thread for him to achieve this kind of eradication of the person who killed his wife and daughter. This question of what is virtual, what is fact, becomes really beautifully slippery.
You're right about the heavy lifting, because if you think about it, Denzel Washington's character is a former police officer who was investigating a serial killer. That killer killed his wife and daughter. Denzel killed the killer, and now he's landed in jail. That's a really complex narrative, good guy, bad guy narrative. And now he's involved in this training experiment to help catch other types of serial killers. When Sid escapes, the only person they think is capable of catching him, because he's done it hundreds of times in a simulation, is the character played by Denzel Washington. They tell him, if you can catch this guy, we're going to give you a full pardon. There's this scene which I thought, honestly, some parts of this movie are so campy and weird. I have to say first, I watched a trailer to this movie where they were showing Sid out on the town, like in his very first engagement with society. And the music is Saturday Night Fever. So they're showing him walking through the streets. And there's that weird kind of disco song playing when he gets his body.
It's gay.
I feel like you're going to wind up convincing the critics they should have loved this movie, Justin.
Well, definitely in terms of its queer ontological capacities, yes.
Yeah. So I'm not going to show the full scene because I realized earlier that it's nothing but screams, but basically Sid goes into a nightclub and just starts murdering people. And he's up on stage and he discovers a MIDI controller. So he starts sampling people's screams and then develops a kind of sound installation based on people's screams. I don't know what this scene is supposed to convey, really.
I have a lot of thoughts. Can I reset the scene slightly? Can I just describe it a little bit differently? Is that okay?
Of course.
So Sid goes off in his purple zoot suit, which was amazing, and ends up at a place called Media Zone, the 90s dream of tech and bodies interacting in a nightlife situation. What we might now call an immersive experience. You have live feed technology, so you can stream what's happening in the club online, so people can engage from far away. And they can also see it on TV. And there are both kind of like typical nightlife embodied figures like go-go dancers and waitresses and waiters who are highly sexualized. And we have a lot of amazing late 90s fashion happening with the kind of club goers. There's also a stage space where there is already set up a bunch of electronic music equipment. As Sid enters, he somehow takes the entire club hostage with one gun and just one scream. It's pretty impressive. And what he begins to do is to let people know he's going to either kill them or torture them so he can create a soundscape. And this soundscape is really interesting because, of course, he begins to layer different sounds of pain and torture that sort of is his own symphony of pain. It's not surprising that a person whose AI consciousness is trained on a bunch of serial killers is going to be interested in the kind of actual haptics and sonic relationship to pain because he's only ever understood it as knowledge and not as practice. This kind of aesthetic turn of pain and trauma becomes really important. This is the connection of the virtual to the theatrical. I read this as Artaud. I read this as Artaud gives us the first time we kind of use virtual reality in literature. He talks about theater as a virtual reality and the ways we have to think about catharsis and object permanence within the theater as a way to really understand what the virtual might mean for us. And I think it's really important that he starts at Media Zone, which is this highly socio-technical space, and then leaves to go to the Olympic Auditorium to create this ultimate death TV. I think it's really important to think about the theatrics of this because actually, if nothing else, the creators of this film were highly aware of like the power of fascistic public discipline and the ways in which our Western notions of both power and pleasure are caught up in the theater of pain. Very interesting for me in terms of a performance studies relationship to this film.
Before I come to you, Ben, I just wanted to ask one quick question of Justin, which is, eventually they find Sid, one of his last stops is at the TV station. The scene where there's a First Nations person talking about how, did you have any linkage to that from what you were talking about?
Because it, of course, comes back to my uber critique of this film, which is just that it's a white nationalist film somehow, but not on purpose. Like it's trying to think about the problem of whiteness and white masculinity. And it does so through the use of the destruction of Black and brown bodies. So basically it just performs American colonialism, American imperialism in this techno-autocratic, networked dream of the future. And of course, the First Nations individual, the man who's speaking, is trying to think about how we can connect. At this point in the film, it imagines a future where America has closed its borders. And there's tons of ways in which you can read the current kind of Trump administration's use of ICE.
Yes.
And its kind of policies in relation to this, because it is imagining a very similar kind of future that we are watching in America.
Yes.
And you can imagine the kind of police that we see in the VR world being the ICE agents of the future, connecting and corralling the various people who don't fit in society. But I think that scene brings us back to this question of like, what will white men do to sustain their own white maleness?
Sorry, Ben, did you want to come in?
I was just going to bring the discussion back to the AI training simulation that is there to train the police force, right? And so you think that humans participating in the simulation, or maybe perhaps the organization of the police force might be learning in a way, but clearly Sid is learning, right? So Sid as an AI within a simulation is learning from that environment and is being shaped by that environment. And I think this reflects a little on the idea that AI is a tool. So tools reshape the environments of the people using the tools. So they're kind of really formative. And I think AI is formative in that kind of way. So you can see Sid learning and being shaped by his environment. So Sid as an AI is not just that he has these personalities of all these murderers in him. He's also been shaped through a environment where people are trying to kill him, right? And he's probably repetitively been through that. He's learned to enjoy that because that's what his entire world is. His entire world is nothing seems to matter if it's destroyed because there's no stakes. And this repetitive environment of him being chased, and he has pleasure in it. And when he comes out into the actual world, you see this pleasure in cruelty all the way through all of those scenes. And I think that really interesting to me when we think about what we're learning or what we're training when we're training AI, because what are we training AI to take pleasure in? Normally, we're thinking about what are we training AI to do for us? But I think there's other things that are being learned and adapted to as well.
In fact, when Barnes is trying to think about where Sid might have gone, just before he tracks him down to the TV station, he says he craves feedback and he needs a large audience. And I think that really kind of jives with the needs of artificial intelligence, this idea of more data and reinforcement learning. Like it kind of makes sense that Sid would seek that pathway.
I was thinking about all the terrible things that Grok seems to do, right? There's too many stories to even summarize them. But it's also doing those things because users are trying to get it to do those things, right? To test it out and seeing what it can do. But then it's learning about that. It's learning at a different level about trying to get people to manipulate things. So when we're trying to manipulate AI or use it as a means to an end, then this is an environment that AI is adapting to. And then that has then repercussions.
I really love what you said, Ben, in terms of thinking about kind of use from pleasure or the kind of erotics of kind of evolving knowledge that we get to witness with Sid. And I also thought it was interesting to think about his use of self-harm as his first kind of move after he kills another human, cuts his finger and he tastes his own quote unquote blood. And then he moves to, of course, tasting human blood. And there's this question around, for me, about this kind of cannibal AI and the kind of realization of knowledge that happens in any total knowledge project. What becomes legible and readable within any type of large system of knowledge becomes really interesting in terms of what will have been cannibalized to make the effect of that knowledge become praxis.
Also, because what becomes taboo is like an embodied, almost implicit cultural thing. And Sid doesn't have any of that.
Right.
Justin, just because you've used this phrase a few times, could you just explain to us all what you mean by total knowledge project?
Pulling the idea of total knowledge project from the book The Imperial Archive by Thomas Richards, which was written in 1993, Richards takes apart a whole bunch of really key literary figures to think about the trauma of larger knowledge projects in his book and the ways in which the entire system of governance becomes a way to tacitly manage knowledge and move it around so that there is not one central network of knowledge, so that no one can tap in and then use and then destroy the kind of imperial order, which of course Sid is both trying to cannibalize that order and perform it simultaneously.
That has a lot of connections with conversations around open data, open science, the idea of the collective knowledge project for the large majority of the people is really interesting because you get to share resources. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of good that can come from that. But powerful players are also interested in the collective knowledge project and having access to those resources and also having the means to exploit those resources much faster and more completely than other people who might be accessing that knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing that the writers and director of the movie did, and I'm just going to rush us through the climax of the movie. So Barnes does eventually destroy Sid's body in one of their shootouts. The psychologist that Barnes is working with, Carter, I think is her last name, her little girl has been kidnapped by Sid in the real world, and he's hidden her. So they need to revive Sid somehow in order to find out where the girl is hidden. So they plan to revive Sid in a virtual environment, but they don't want him to know that he's not living anymore in the real world. So Barnes and Carter, they go into that dangerous VR experience to talk to him. And eventually Sid does figure out that he's trapped and he has a total meltdown, which nearly kills both Carter and Barnes. But they manage to escape. The police chief comes in and liberates Carter. Carter kills the computer programmer that created Sid, Lindenmeyer. She releases Barnes from the VR system, like just before it kills him. There's this amazing, it's like what do you call that? A meter, you know, like, oh my God, we're so close to frying this person who's in this device. And it's really like low quality.
It's like an MS Paint of a brain being fried. It's gorgeous. Highly recommend watching just for that. And of course, Russell Crowe's ass.
Yeah, so they destroy what remains of Sid's programming through this activity. And I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you about how the movie ends. What did you think about Sid's reaction to finding out that he's back in the virtual world?
I just found it implausible that he was taken in even for a moment. The virtual world would have had to have been modeled at the environment, unless they had a training scenario in this particular building. There was that. But also, Sid's just spent a period of time running around in a nanotechnology body in a physical spatial environment. And so I think he would notice the difference, right? I kind of lost the thread when that happened.
We don't think we're the only one, but I think the whole film loses itself at the end of the film.
I know. It's
like, we don't really know what to do with all of this. We've built some interesting cosmological structures here in terms of what the universe can and can't do, but don't worry, he's going to die.
Yeah. It's so much of it is really anticlimactic.
It's like the internet, anticlimactic.
I think what's interesting, though, and maybe this is sort of like a narrative that appeals to people, this idea that you could identify a dangerous technology and then just take it out of existence. And it kind of just made me think more generally about AI sabotage, people that are trying to ruin the data sets of AI. And I'm just interested in that. What would be the repercussions in the real life for doing something like that, even if you could demonstrate that it was a dangerous technology?
I think we're still at this phase in movie representations of computers where it's possible to have a locatable thing that you finish with. So there's still like the chip, the AI personality that can be taken out of the body or can be destroyed. And I think although AI programs are still embodied in infrastructure and they're still kind of physical, which is easy to forget, they're just not locatable in the same way that you can blow it up at the end of a Hollywood movie.
More generally, if you listened to the podcast before and you listened to our episode on Cherry 2000, this idea that you can separate knowledge between the mind and the body, I think is a really interesting theme that both movies follow. You can have this character module that is your personality and everything, and that somehow your body is separate from all of that, I think is really interesting.
To go back to the Sid getting the body moment, it was kind of interesting that the nano body apes the virtual body, which I guess has to happen because you want the same actor to play them. But there's no particular reason that would have happened. There's something peculiar about what Sid looked like that's part of his personality.
A question we keep coming to in every episode, it feels, that engages in anything about, especially the robotics or the cybernetic, right, is why do these systems have to then become humanoid or represent the human? And that's what you're speaking to, Ben. That being said, it's an interesting thing in relation to the title of the film.
Oh, let's get into it. Why is this movie called Virtuosity? What were your thoughts about that?
So when I thought about Virtuosity, I thought about the kind of shifting relationships to skill and expertise, right? To be virtuosic is to have great skill in action. So like you're playing an instrument or you're able to rewire something, you're virtuosic in that skill. And so what we have here is this interesting way in which what happens when we enflesh knowledge and what is lost or gained from that enfleshment. And that question of, is the person who is virtuosic free in their form or in their skill? And this whole film wants to play on this question of freedom, right? Parker is penetrated by a needle and tracked to the entire film. Sid escapes and frees himself from the VR into the fleshy world. And of course, there's all the permutations of the prisoner and pursued question of freedom here. And so for me, this question of virtuosity is what this film asks about a performance of freedom and our desire to create systems that supposedly free us of our fleshy problems. AI is going to fix it. AI is going to do it for us. AI is going to be the thing that will speed up and clean up our lives. What are we free from when we have created something that will do everything for us?
We do a lot of work in our research group about the role of embodiment in knowledge production. We're working with this artist, Liz Rosenfeld, and one of their major complaints about the idea of virtuosity is that it's totally not a human concept. This idea of perfection, humans are not perfect, they're flawed. You can go back to Jack Halberstam's work on queer failure, or even Munoz's work talking about the idea of queerness as practice of an ideal, but understanding that ideal isn't here. And I thought that virtuosity was just a very interesting title to give an AI.
So the idea of a virtuoso has been connected to a divine spirit. Someone like Michelangelo, his creative genius was understood as a kind of divine genius acting through that person. I think that European Renaissance stage where we have so many transformations and technologies like drawing, which split the mind from the body in the production of architecture, for instance, you start to see a connection from that to ideas of the virtual and the actual, or the mind and the body, which are also kind of being played out in these kinds of technologies in the 1990s. I think you've got a kind of whole intersection between a kind of virtual as technological other space, but also spiritual other space, and how that connects to virtuosity in the sense of capacity and genius and so on.
That's a lot, Ben.
I looked up the etymology of virtual in the wonderful etymology online dictionary. It says late 14th century, influencing by physical virtues or capabilities, effective with respect to inherent natural qualities. From medieval Latin virtualis, from Latin virtus, excellence, potency, efficacy, literally manliness or manhood, which I never knew. So I think that it's always quite interesting when you go back into these things, but I think that really kind of comes back to that other reading of the film as well.
Maybe it goes back to something you said earlier, which I thought was really interesting about what we are teaching AI to get pleasure from. There's this line from, your creator sets the tone for what's important. You then have your set of experiences that reinforce that. You learn a number of other unintentional things from that engagement with the world, and it becomes this feedback loop in that way. To kind of wrap up this particular episode of the podcast, I just wanted to ask both of you if there are any main messages that you take away from this film.
So one of the things the film brought up for me, which we haven't really addressed, so I'm worried this is a bit of a tangent, is around the history of killing machines, really, which I think Sid is a version of. And this is something that part of the present, is part of contemporary applications of AI. We're seeing lots of developments motivated by all the wars that are going on right now to integrate AI with various weapons like drones and so on. But also there's a longer history of technology and warfare, but also AI and military applications. There's a contrast between Sid as a killing machine or a murdering machine, with the idea of a robot soldier, right? That might be what at various times AI has seemed to promise. You can imagine the attraction of a robot soldier being around command and control. They will follow orders without thinking about it. So it kind of removes the human element. And then I think there's something different going on with Sid, but also there's something different with the kind of AI paradigm we have now, which is based around learning patterns from selections of human behavior. Sid isn't working logically. He doesn't have rule that he's following. He's enjoying things, right? Because he's developed a personality that is based on learning from a particularly kind of gruesome selection. There's a kind of unpredictability to it. I kind of worry that that's what we might end up with.
I kind of went the same way as you in terms of thinking about the pipeline, actually, of how these things are developed, tested, and trialed. The idea that this system is being tested with prison labor, the fact that the heavy surveillance within the prison system that eventually finds its way slowly outside of the prison system, thinking of the Palestine laboratory and all of the complex AI tools that are being used in that conflict, and then being sold and utilized in other situations around the globe. The idea that the way these things will wind up being put into our world is through people who build them. Somebody will say, hey, I want to build this police training system using an AI that's been trained on lots of serial killer data, and you will find somebody willing to build that. For me, it goes back to that paper from Gary Griffin that it's not about the technology itself, but the way that it's deployed that is going to lead to inequalities. For example, if you're thinking about your robot soldier, the idea behind that is to limit losses on the side of the person deploying the robot soldier, but you don't care about the losses on the other side. The police commissioner, she cares about the safety of her police officers. She does not care about the safety of the prison laborer. Where we see the benefits of the technology, we don't care equally about all potential beneficiaries and what they might either get out of using this technology or how they might suffer from it. And that is one of the major concerns. And also, who actually will reap the most benefits from this technology that takes a lot of shared resources from the planet, requires a lot of immoral practices as regards labor. It's a technology that is based on so many things that are unethical. How can we even begin to talk about an ethical application of that technology without a reflection on that? I really want to thank you both for watching this movie. I really enjoyed hearing both of your perspectives on it. It does kind of shape how I think I'm going to think about this movie in the future and how I might talk about it in the future.
I really enjoyed thinking with you both and taking it in so many different avenues. And if you want to follow any of our references that we've discussed, because I know we quoted a lot of different things today, you can check out our show notes, which will have links to that information.
Tracy, thanks for taking us back to the 90s. I really enjoyed that. Don't miss any of our conversations about popular culture and AI. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and be sure to leave us a review.
Thank you for listening. This podcast is funded by a UK Research and Innovation Future Leaders Fellowship.